But just continuing, Thucydides says, 10 years after this, in other words, 10 years after the Battle of Marathon, the barbarian, which is to say the Persians, returned to invade Greece with a mighty armada, intent on enslavement. With great danger impending, the Spartans, as the preeminent power, assumed leadership of the allied Greek forces, and the Athenians, having resolved to abandon their city in the face of the Persian advance, packed up their possessions, took to their boats, and became sailors. Now, just as a sidebar, Themistocles is absolutely instrumental in all of that. And the point here in Thucydides is that as a result of that invasion, the Athenians became sailors, which is to say they are only getting better as a naval power. And then continuing, the barbarian, which is to say the Persians, was repulsed by a common effort. There we have it. There we have the common effort, the unity. But not much later, both the Greeks who were in revolt from the Persian king and those who had fought together as allies became divided between the Athenian side and the Spartan side. In other words, what is happening is that the leagues that were formed, the alliances of the Greeks to stop their internal fighting, those leagues, those alliances are breaking apart. And Thucydides does not name it right here, and he's about to simply call it a dispute. But this turns out to be the origin or the truest cause of the Peloponnesian War. And just continuing, the Athenians and the Spartans were quite clearly the two greatest powers, the one dominant on land, the other by sea. For a short time, this defensive alliance held together. Then the Spartans and the Athenians got into a dispute and made war on each other with their respective allies. And any of the Greeks who had ever had differences of their own now joined one of these groupings. And so what we're seeing here is back in paragraph 15, those great powers that were mentioned, those are the Spartans and the Athenians, because it's the Spartans and Athenians who all the rest of the Greeks follow. And just continuing, Thucydides says, so over the whole time from the Persian Wars up to the present war, in other words, from the Persian Wars up to the Peloponnesian War, while sometimes under truce and sometimes fighting, either with each other or with allies who had revolted, the two sides developed their readiness for war and got training in the hard school of experience. Now, it's that last line right there, the hard school of experience, that prefigures what I had mentioned previously. Thucydides says in his own name, namely, that war is a hard master. But what's important for us to see right here in the ending of this paragraph 18 is that Thucydides is summarizing the entirety of the period between the Persian War and the Peloponnesian War, which is to say that Thucydides is summarizing here the origins or the causes of the Peloponnesian War. And it's going to turn out that this has an enormous amount to do with techne. But let me simply finish the archaeology by reading paragraph 19. Thucydides continues by saying the Spartans exercised their leadership not by making their allies subject to tribute, but by taking good care to ensure that they were governed by oligarchies and served Spartan interests exclusively. The Athenians, by contrast, ruled by taking possession of the ships of allied cities over time and by imposing fixed taxes on all these. Their own military resources available for this war, in other words, the military resources of the Athenians, was therefore greater than it had ever been when the alliance against Persia was intact and at the height of its power. Okay, and so that's the end of the archaeology. And what Thucydides has done is he's brought us to a summary of the events that lead up to the war. And then in that last paragraph 19, he's held up for our consideration the very different arts of rule employed on the one hand by the Spartans for their colonies and empire versus that of the Athenians for their colonies of empire. And the primary difference is that whereas the Spartans did not impose tributes on their colonies of empire, the Athenians did impose tributes. And not only tributes, but they also took the people's navies as well. And so what we have is a very powerful land force with the Spartans and a very powerful sea force with the Athenians. But at the more fundamental level, the difference between the Spartans and the Athenians, which is only reflected in Spartans' land power and the Athenian sea power, is that Athens is the city of innovation and Sparta is the city of traditional piety. And so the question here is whether or not it's the piety of Sparta that prevails against the revolutionary Athenians, at least according to Thucydides. But remember, there's no mention of the divine or the gods in the archaeology. But that being said, the culmination of this more fundamental tension of traditional piety and radical innovation happens later in Book 1. But before I address it, we have to see the amazing turn of events that Thucydides is going to make immediately here in order to end the archaeology and explain what's going to happen in the rest of the text. And what I mean by that is Thucydides is about to tell us his method of inquiry regarding the events of the Peloponnesian War that we're now entering into and that he's just summarized.